All right, hey guys, today we're going to talk about leaders in the civil rights movement. The questions are, how was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., how is he different in his approach to dealing with discrimination? He's probably one of the greatest leaders our country's ever had. So how does that different approach really make him stand out? And how does the Central High, which is Little Rock, Arkansas Central High School event, bring the nation and the federal government on this collision course into the civil rights movement? Okay, so we're going to start with leaders and groups in the civil rights movement. Old laws are being ignored totally, like the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which are going to come, pretty soon after the Civil War. The 14th, you need to know, is due process of law and equal protection under the law as long as you are a citizen. So, our definition of citizen would be born here. And the ones that are born here, this is a non-issue. They should all be treated equally with the same due process as anyone. The fact is, African Americans were not being treated that way. 15th Amendment, voting rights for all Americans. Now, when that was passed, it did not at the time mean for women or Native Americans. And of course, they're also going to try to limit African Americans throughout the South by passing Jim Crow laws, which we'll get to in a minute. That's going way back into American One, if you recall. But the 15th Amendment had promised voting rights for all Americans, not based on race or religion. So these new policies throughout the South are enforced. And again, I'm not going back and teaching all that to you. But if you'll remember, Jim Crow laws were passed that pushed through segregation. And Jim Crow, that term, Jim Crow was not an actual person. There was a play that was done in New York City, and a lot of people came to see the play. It became sort of famous, and it was about Jumpin' Jim Crow, and it was a person who dressed in blackface and fumbled around on the stage, and his lines made him sound like he wasn't very intelligent, kind of symbolizing that African Americans, as people thought at the time, were stereotyping them as unintelligent, and all that from the time period of slavery. So we get the term Jim Crow laws to attach to how we're going to limit the rights of African Americans. Plessy versus Ferguson is passed in 1896, which had to do with Homer Plessy, wanting to argue for his freedom, sue for his freedom, and the decision was separate but equal, that we would be separate but equal. He wanted his freedom in regards to his rights. He rode a white railroad car and wanted the right to do that. The decision was no, that African Americans would ride in separate vehicles, and that was legal. De jure segregation is segregation based on law. The word jurisprudence today means the study of the law. So if you're going to law school, you are studying jurisprudence. De jure means law. So there would be laws passed. So think about what some of them are, and I want you to write some of them here that would be passed, especially in the South. For example, separate schools, right? Separate water fountains eventually. Separate seating on buses. Separate seating in theaters for African American versus white patrons. So those would be laws. De facto segregation is segregation based on social condition, such as poverty. There were a lot more African Americans impoverished than white Americans just because of the issue of slavery and lack of education. They had been denied. But also think about even like when you walk into the cafeteria here at Chatham Central. Are there people sitting in like groups? It may not be racial groups, but they're sitting with people like them. And that's sort of how we segregate naturally. So the NAACP starts a movement to resist this segregation. It's interesting that the NAACP was interracial, which means it wasn't just all African Americans in it. And even today, not too long ago, I went to a workshop and a gentleman there was talking about how he was a member of the NAACP and he was a white guy. So NAACP has always been interracial. They were founded by W.B. Du Bois, as you remember, at the Niagara Movement in Canada, where he is going to meet. And they were denied a room in New York, remember, so he went to Canada and got a hotel room and a conference room, and they met to form the NAACP. They're going to work to get anti-lynching bills passed. Remember Ida B. Wells. And to end segregation. Thurgood Marshall is going to be an NAACP lawyer who will argue the Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954. This is a huge landmark case, maybe the #1 case in American history. And so let me show you a few pictures before I go further. Here's examples of Jim Crow colored entrance in the theater. So even you entered at a different place. This one is for a laundry company. We wash for white people only. So that gives you those ideas. Here's Thurgood Marshall, who we're talking about here, NAACP lawyer, will argue and win the Brown versus Board of Education case that says students should be able to go to the school closest to them. It should not be based on your race. Okay, now, as you are, I'm sure, aware, but I will teach you, when this comes down in 1954 and it's supposed to happen, that schools now will integrate and children will go to a school based on how close they live to it, not based on the color of their skin. Many states in the South will refuse to comply. It will take years before they actually do. Even here at Chatham Central, it's not going to happen in 1954, and I will teach you that later. Okay, so then we have Rosa Parks, who refuses to get out of her bus seat when she was told to allow a white man to have her seat. She was arrested by just refusing to get up. And that was December 1st of 55. You need to kind of remember that date, December 1st of 55. Here she is at her booking, being fingerprinted with the police officer. And her arrest will pretty much set off the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, you'll see this later in Eyes on the Prize, a documentary that's probably one of the best I've shown ever in my classes. But it is how the people of Montgomery, Alabama, especially African Americans, boycott the bus system. And the bus was how they got to work. So they rode to work on the bus, they rode home on the bus. And to work would be like being a maid for a white family or two. It could also be working in some kind of store, maybe as a janitor or something. You would never be allowed to own the store at this point, or very seldom did you see that. So they would be working in kind of menial jobs, but they would be sewers or things like that. They would ride to their job that way. Well, then they just boycotted it and started walking. So the city was losing money in their transit system because they're putting gas in these buses and hiring bus drivers, but no one to ride the bus. So that was a very, very clever strategy to hurt the city of Montgomery for these decisions. Okay, then we have CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. Now we're going to have several groups. You have to know their acronym. This one, also interracial, is one of the first groups, CORE, and they decided to lead demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations in Baltimore and Chicago, and they are the first to use sit-ins in restaurants. So this is a method of desegregation. You would go sit at the lunch counter if you're African American, and the owner would refuse to serve you just because you're African American, and you would sit there anyway. People would come in, they'd get angry, they would throw food on you, spit on you, call you horrible names, hit you, and you were not supposed to react. I wonder if we could have that kind of patience that these people had in doing that. It also reminds me of a story about Miss Mesemer. So just remind me at some point to tell you that story about her experience when she was in college with an African American friend of hers. Anyway, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Is going to come on the scene here. African Americans are being physically, verbally abused. He preaches nonviolence, which he had studied Gandhi in India, and Gandhi totally preached that. We'll talk more about that when we get to Vietnam. He is a 26-year-old pastor, forms SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he says, we're going to go have these sit-ins and demonstrations, and we're not going to attack back. When they hit us, we're just going to take it. And the idea was that that would play on people's sympathies that, these folks are being targeted and should not be. He shifted his focus to the South and called upon African American churches in the South to help. And he becomes a symbol of nonviolent protest for the entire world and ends up winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, began in Raleigh, North Carolina, gave students, now this is not high school, this would be college, students a voice. Robert Moses, their leader, a Harvard grad, and made SNCC very powerful. SNCC will pick up with the protests. And then we have September 57, 9 African American teenagers won the right, notice this is after the 54 Brown case, to be admitted to Central High School, which was the white school. And 2,000 white students. Can you imagine being these 9 students? The governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, a moderate, but then started listening to white supremacy defenders, joined that cause and ordered the National Guard to block these 9 kids from going to school. An angry mob joined them. This is a amazing, horrifying scene that you will see in Eyes on the Prize. Can you imagine coming to school in the mornings and there's a line of people there that want to kill you? And are allowed to stand out there and scream at you and do things. So a couple of pictures of that. Here is Elizabeth Eckford, I will teach you about later. Look at this person. Laughing at her, screaming at her, calling her names. As she's trying to walk in. Here is another one. Eventually what will happen is President Eisenhower will send in the U.S. Army to Little Rock and ensure desegregation. So once the governor sent in the National Guard, Eisenhower sends in the Army. He says, no, I'm President of the United States. I will get rid of that National Guard and send in the Army to walk these students to class. And that's what ends up happening, which is really, really amazing. And to finish it up, CORE is going to lead a sit-in to desegregate a coffee shop in Chicago in 1943, way early. And February 1st of 1960, SNCC will conduct a sit-in in Greensboro at the Woolworths. This is the famous 4 black students that sat at the white lunch counter at the Woolworths. And I should show you that Greensboro sit-in. These 4 guys, this is later. They took a photograph kind of remembering. I also want you to note these chairs, these 4 chairs were taken out of that Woolworths and are now in the Smithsonian American History Museum, which is the coolest thing ever. And this is often what would happen to you in a sit-in, where you would just be, food would be poured on you, people are laughing at you, you'd be hit, all kinds of nasty things. And they're pushing this nonviolent resistance of Dr. King. Okay, so let's go back and do the EQs, which would be, how is Dr. King different? So he's going to push nonviolent resistance and encouraging people to use civil disobedience. It's effective because it's obviously these people are not harming anyone else when they're being attacked, so that plays well on the news. How does the Central High Little Rock event bring the nation and federal government into the civil rights movement? Because the governor had brought in the National Guard to stop the students, and the President of the United States, Eisenhower, brings in the Army to stop the National Guard. So they're going to allow the students to go to school with the use of the United States Army. Okay, make sure you write your 3 questions and do your summary at the end.